There we go. Sorry about that. I had the mic muted to not pick up a bunch of background noise while I was getting set up. Thanks for that, Lapusa. Chris Santee here as well. Got a good set of folks here in the chat room. Thanks for joining the show. I've got some pretty good articles lined up to share with you guys. I know there's a lot of good projects going on out there right now. I'd like to get some of those on the show next week, but I couldn't quite find the bits I wanted. So we'll talk about that in a sec. Chris, glad you joined the show. Chris has an article coming to the Telerik blogs soon, so I get to review that today, and I'm sure we'll be posting that pretty soon. Let's start off with an article that I checked out this week. I don't really know the author very well. The person goes by just their first name, I'm assuming, or possibly their last name, so it's Nicole or Nicole. It's WebAssembly for front-end web development. And they talk about Emscripten, Rust, and Blazor in the same context because they're all WebAssembly frameworks. It's a pretty good read. It gives you a good overview of what each of those technologies is and how they deal with with WebAssembly. And they're the first two, Emscripten and Rust WebAssembly, they all kind of target just building binaries for WebAssembly. And then they go on to talk about Blazor and how it's different, and it offers a framework on top of WebAssembly through the .NET ecosystem. It's a really good read. I suggest you check it out if you're looking at Blazor or WebAssembly in general. If I remember correctly, Emscripten is actually being used as part of the mono runtime for WebAssembly. So I think there's actually a dependency in there somewhere still. I haven't really looked in that deep to the mono stuff lately, so it's possible it's not there anymore, but I'm pretty sure they were using that initially. So it's a really good read. And then they get into how to build an application with Blazor and what some of the current caveats are. So make sure you check that one out. I'll put that in the show notes, which I noticed I forgot to publish my show notes from last week, so I'll get a double shot of show notes out there this later today. So give that a read and let me know what you think. I think that's a really good one. Next up is .NET Rocks. .NET Rocks has an amazing track record for having wonderful content, and they were, Richard and Carl were at NDC London with us, and they interviewed Steve Sanderson and Daniel Roth, which I haven't gotten time to listen to the show yet, unfortunately, so I don't know what exactly they covered. I'm going to assume they talked about the same things that were in the NDC London sessions that I went to. So I would imagine this is a nice distilled hour show of all the things that they covered in the workshop in their two sessions. So Lapusa says it was a great show, so I suggest checking that out. .NET Rocks in general, just subscribe to it. It's really good source of content for anything .NET, so make sure you check them out. Looks like several of you have already listened to it out there, but if you're catching this on YouTube at a later time or something, you're not already subscribed to the .NET Rocks podcast, make sure you get the show and give it a listen. And Goran says that the videos from NDC London are also available out there. I can go ahead and put those in the show notes for today's show as well. Make sure you got all your NDC goodness in there. I've got a blog post in about NDC London as well that has some good bits in it. Next up, not necessarily a Blazor related thing, so indirectly. I was in a C# Fritz's show the other day, watching him stream, and I was talking to a frequent viewer, Janescu. I think you're out there watching now. Janescu was talking about QSharp and Blazor. And I jokingly said we should call it Quasar or Quasor or something like that. But Janescu tipped me off to this this contest that they're doing with QSharp right now. So I thought I'd share that with everybody. And it sounds like Genescu might be working on something that is Blazor QSharp crossover. And this is what inspired it. So I thought I'd share this with everybody. Looks like there is a competition going on to test out QSharp, and QSharp is a new quantum-based computing language that is available for the .NET ecosystem. So yeah, Genescu's clearing that up. Quasar, QSharp plus Blazor, why not? I thought that would be a fun idea there. So good luck on that project, Genescu. Looking forward to see what comes out of that, and we can talk about it again when there's some more news. But I wanted to at least share the contest with everybody and let them know that the contest is out there going on. I haven't got a chance to check out QSharp myself. I know it has to deal with quantum computing, and it's the next big thing out of the Microsoft labs. So it sounds like a lot of fun. We'll make sure we talk about that again. So today I wanted to do some demos. Some of it is, well, actually all of it's going to come out of the workshop that was at NDC. If you haven't seen the workshop yet, you can go to AKAMS Blazor Workshop. And what you build in the workshop is this pizza app. So this blazing pizza app, it's a really great looking app, and it has quite a few steps that are involved in building a real world application. It makes it a great piece of workshop content. And one of the pieces I wanted to focus on today is this session number 5, where they talk about authenticating users and authorization. Now, the reason I chose this is because I hear questions about this quite a bit, and I thought I'd try to help clear up some confusion that's been talked about, mainly around identity and authentication. So I get a lot of questions about Blazor, and people ask, does Blazor work with authentication? So what usually they really mean is not, does Blazor work with authentication? Because Blazor is essentially a client-side framework, and authentication is generally a server-side thing. So what I'm finding is they're not asking if the authentication is something that works. They're asking if identity, the Microsoft framework, is compatible with Blazor. So identity is the framework that is in ASP.NET Core or ASP.NET, either one, that handles authentication, but it's a custom local authentication system that you deploy on your server, and you collect your own information for a database that contains things like people's usernames and their hashed passwords, and it sets up kind of a pre-prescribed authentication system, an authorization system on your server. So there's no integration point directly with that right now. There's no like wrappers or helpers or anything like that to get you started with that. And that might be something we do on a future show once I see what the current state of all that is. But what I wanted to show today is the fact that you can authenticate users and authorize access with Blazor. You just don't have easy access to the identity framework quite yet. And I would assume that with the popularity of identity, that's something that's on the roadmap. And there will be things to help us generate, login views and stuff for that way down the road. But currently, there just isn't any of that. So I'm going to actually walk through this authentication piece that is in the workshop and talk about some of the aspects of authentication. I actually wrote a custom auth middleware once that took authentication for, or it implemented authentication for ASP.NET and Yammer. Because ironically, Microsoft has authentication for Twitter, Facebook, and many other non-Microsoft things built into ASP.NET out of the box, but their own Yammer framework has no built-in authentication that you can just easily add to ASP.NET. It was something that they wanted to use at my old job, and it's a piece of middleware that I actually wrote. So I've got a little bit of experience with this stuff. There's an article out there. Let's see. I'll see if I can find it real quick. It's an article that I wrote about actually creating that piece of middleware, and I put that out on Simple Talk, or the Redgate publication. There we go. So I've got this piece that I wrote here. It's got some good diagrams, because the one thing that's kind of a pain when you're working with authentication or OAuth is all the handshaking that goes on. You kind of need to understand that process of how all these handshakes work before you can really implement something like this without some nice little helper functions and whatnot. So in this article, I have kind of a diagram of how that authentication handshake works. And I'll put this in the show notes too, so you guys can take a look. I'll post it in the chat room here as well if you want to check that out right away. But this is kind of the flow, and you can see it's not a very straightforward thing. You're going back and forth between the client and the user, and possibly another server in the process, and you're kind of doing a lot of communicating back and forth. So in this scenario, and it's going to be very similar to when you work with Blazor, you're going to have to do some of this stuff from scratch. So this is kind of how the process works. The user requests a login, and in MVC, if there may be other service providers, so we could have things like Twitter authentication, a custom authentication system, whatever. That system will decide, whether that user's already logged in or not, and if they're not, which service provider to direct them to log them in. And then when you go through that process, you see if you actually go out to the authentication service, say Twitter, something like that, and send the user there to log in. That user does their login on that system. So if it was Twitter, which is going to be in our example, Twitter logs them in, and if it's successful, they send back a token to the application. The application then takes that token and makes sure that you can access that system with that type of or with that user's login. If that user has access to that system, they send back this access grant token, and then it keeps going back and forth. Requests UserInfo. This is get all between the server, the authentication service, and then finally you return an identity and complete the login with MVC. So it's a pretty convoluted process. It actually jumps through a lot of steps to make that happen. And we're going to work with some of this in this workshop piece. So if you want to get really deep into the weeds on this, you can read through the article. It talks about creating your own piece of middleware. When I wrote this, Owen was the middleware framework that we were, or interface that was being used. This is changed, I believe, in ASP.NET Core, but it's very similar syntax-wise. So it's a good read. Make sure you check that out if you're really, really interested in the deep parts of it. So if you want to do this on your own, I would suggest starting from the very beginning. I'm going to start from the end of step 4 and just immediately into the authentication step of step 5. And I'm using a fork of the Blazor Workshop, because currently if you go out to the AKAMS shortcut or on GitHub, .NET Presentations Blazor Workshop, you're going to find out that it doesn't work in Blazor 0.80. So fortunately, there is a pull request out here, And if you look, there's update to .NET Core Preview 2. And I just jumped onto this pull request and pulled down those bits, and everything seemed to be working fine for the project. So I'm kind of on a new release that's not baked into the main master branch of the repo yet. So just for some clarity there, that's what's happening. I'm on Visual Studio 2019, so things may crash along the way. This is the absolute latest version that came out, I believe, yesterday afternoon. I haven't had too much time to kick the tires extensively, so there may be some failures along the way. I've heard that the stability just isn't quite there yet. I'm going to open up that Blazing Pizza app, and we'll see how far we can go without this thing crashing. This is the fun of working with the latest and greatest bits. You never know what's going to happen next, but it comes with the territory, and right now it actually is kind of slow as well. It's loading up on my other screen, so I'd like to show it over here, but it's preparing solution, which on Jeff Fritz's stream yesterday, it did this forever, this preparing solution. And there were some jokes in the chat room about one of my favorite movies, Spaceballs. He's like, "You're preparing, always preparing." That's how I feel when you see that dialogue sitting there for so long. All right, so looks like our solution is up and running. Still a little on the slow side, still loading some things. All right, get some of these views out of the way. All right, so that should help it spin up a little bit better. And we'll jump back into this documentation here, and we're going to go to session item 5 and start talking about some authentication. Do I have a link to the fork? Absolutely, I can send that over the chat room. So I'm going to go pull requests, update to preview 2. Let's just jump over to Cant 2002's site here, and I'll just do pizza. See if that works. Nope. Blazor Workshop. There it is. Blazor Workshop, and then make sure you have the right branch. So it should be this branch here, and there is the fork for the latest bits of the workshop. I believe that's a community pull request too. I don't quite recognize the name from the team, so I'm not sure. I think that's a nice community pull that's that somebody put together there. All right, so I've got the project open. Let's go jump back to, whoops, I closed that. AKMS Blazor Workshop. Get some of these tabs out of my way, and back over to this documentation. So session 5, no problem, Goran. So session 5 is talking about authentication. And if we look at, let's go ahead and get this app up and running so we can see where its current state is. And first thing that we mention in here is enforcement is on the server. Real security issues must be enforced on the backend server. So the classic security mindset that never trust the client is especially true when talking about authentication and pretty much anything else. So never trust data from the client. Oh, and I'm going to get this fun problem here. Let's see. Unable to connect to IIS. Let's try this one more time. All right, so it looks like let's try stopping IIS. Completely giving this another run. Maybe we'll get lucky. If this doesn't work, it seems like today's show is going to be really short because everything depends on this project working, which it worked yesterday. Even after the updates, I gave this a run and it seemed to be fine. Let's do a clean and rebuild. See if that works. Best case scenario, if this doesn't work, I may need to reboot my machine, which will knock the stream offline. And once I come back, hopefully it'll work. I was testing this out the night before, but like I said, with all the latest and greatest things being all bleeding edge, including Visual Studio, it seems like we might have an issue today. So hopefully not. Pretty extensive build there. Let's hope this spins up a working IIS server. There we go. That's much better. That's a relief. Let me switch over to the coding view here as well. Maybe that'll help. And that'll spin up. So while that's spinning up, let's see what we're going to be doing here. We're going to be working on the server side of the application first, and we're going to add an authorize attribute to our server, or our controller for our pizza orders. Yes, this is taking longer than expected. Thank you, Visual Studio. All right, so hopefully that does get spun up, and it's still going. I can hear it grinding away. It looks like it may even be building a new database. I don't know what this project is doing under the hood right now, but we'll let that go ahead and build for a bit. So we're going to be adding the authorize attribute to the orders controller. This is where the application shows the logged in users pizza orders. This is a pizza application. When we do that, it is going to instruct this endpoint when we hit it to make sure that the user is authorized to view that page. And we're going to start by breaking the application. Oh, we have a working application, so that's good. So we're going to go to orders. And right now it says you're signed out. Please sign in to continue. See, I am on the branch that currently has this already implemented. So I actually need to stop this after all that building. And I need to go to the branch where this hasn't been completed yet. So bear with me. So inside of the project, when you clone it, you will find that there are stop points for all of the workshop pieces. So from session 1 to 8, you'll find folders underneath of that project, just like these here. And I thought I was on the right one. It looks like I am. Wasn't quite expecting that login to work. So let's see. Oh, okay, there we go. Just making sure we're on the right one. And maybe we'll start debugging. All right. Let's just make sure this is still working. And we're going to add this authorize attribute here. And this is going to make sure that we can't view pizza orders if we're not logged in, and is going to redirect us to a login URL. The next thing we're going to do is we have to track whether the user is logged in or not, and that's going to be through the use of cookies. And once we have that cookie, we need to set up some sort of state in the application to let the app know that the current user is actually logged in. So we'll eventually be using a state container, which is essentially in the workshop here. It's essentially a cascading parameter that's wrapped around the entire application. How about using Signal R instead of REST API for authorization? I don't think that would be possible. I'm not sure. It's not something I've invested any time in trying to do. I'm not sure exactly how that would work. The way Signal R works is based off of hubs. I don't know if you could do authentication, or I'm not even sure why that would help any. You may be able to grab if the person's authenticated and then start a Signal R hub that's pushing changes, but I don't know if that's if you'd use Signal R itself for doing the authorization. So this user state provider is going to be a custom component that wraps a cascading parameter that sends the values through our application. We'll set up a login info box and things like that as we step through this. Yeah, instead of doing it over HTTP, I don't know if that would work. You still have to jump out externally to do the actual authorization on, say, Twitter, which isn't going to have a Signal R experience at all. So I don't know how that would be accomplished. If you take a look at that flowchart that I showed earlier in that Redgate article I wrote, it's a pretty complex process that involves more than one party. If you're using identity and it's all being done on the same server, that might be something that's possible. I haven't attempted that at all. So let's double check our app again. Again, that thing took forever to load up. So no orders placed. And I don't have my login button anymore. There we go. So now I'm on the right branch. Want to make sure I had that correct branch up and running. Just kind of refreshing this to make sure I've got everything where it needs to be before I begin. Because we're going to watch this fail after I add this authentication piece. And whenever I stream these things, it hogs a lot of the streaming app hogs a lot of resources. So some of these pages come up a little bit slower than they should. This one is really cranking away today. A lot of these bits aren't quite optimized yet either, so that's not helping matters. What we could try to do is kill debugging, because I know diagnostic tools and things are running. Let's try Control F5 and just do build without debugging. Maybe that'll help this get up and running quicker. So right now, if we're going to keep rebuilding this thing and displaying it, we're not going to be able to move through the application pretty quickly. There we go. That was a lot quicker. All right. So it looks like our app is working pretty well. We can create orders. And right now we have an order. It looks like there's still a little bit of quirks to be worked out, but for the most part, we're up and running again. So we want to come into our server, and on the orders controller, this is what is serving up the data for this bit here, where we're viewing our orders. So all the data for this page is coming from this orders controller. You can see we new up an orders controller, and it attaches to a database context. So this is our pizza score DB context. And then on the get action, it sends us a list of orders. And you can see some of the code commented out here. It might be a little hard with the theme that I'm using. Let's actually zoom in a little bit. I know I get this question a lot, so make sure everybody can see what's going on. I've got a custom theme running here as well. So I don't care to see comments usually, so you'll notice those are really dark on my machine. So for the most part, I view comments as kind of a crutch. So unless you're doing tutorial stuff, they almost shouldn't be seen, in my opinion. So I kind of keep them pretty dark and out of the way. But if you can see this here, it says when we go to the database, there's a where statement that's been commented out. We'll be adding that back in here soon. So once we have an authenticated user, we'll grab their user ID and grab just the orders that belong to them. Right now, we're just grabbing every order in the database, which probably wouldn't be a great thing for a real pizza store. So that's a feature that we'll be adding along the way. Right now, like I said, all those orders come back and they're displayed here. So the next thing we're going to do is come into our controller at the very top. And if we add authorize here at the top of our controller at the class level where it says orders controller, if we add that here, then all of the actions or endpoints underneath of that controller then become authorized or require authorization. If we wanted to just apply this to, say, a single action, like we wanted to say we only want authorized folks to be able to post, then we could just type the authorize attribute right here on that line only, and that would target just that one endpoint or our action. But we want to do this on all of our pizza or orders, so regardless of whether they're placing a new one or just getting the orders, we want to authorize all of those things. So we're going to put it all the way at the top. So we'll let that change save. We'll rebuild and rerun the app. Again, I've got debugging disabled because it just makes things run faster and smoother on a live stream. So let's see if this comes up, and it should no longer let us access the orders for that page. So I did place an order. There should be one order in the database. Notice we have this loading icon here, or text, but nothing has happened. If we go into the console, there are errors. Invalid JSON string. So that's not quite the error we were supposed to get. What we were supposed to get is the error that is displayed here in the workshop notes. So it looks like there are additional errors in there as well, but what we're doing is we're getting bumped to a login page instead. So it says here, if you try to run the application, you'll find that you can no longer place orders and no longer retrieve details that are already placed. The requests are going to another endpoint. So when the page requests the orders, the request then gets bumped to this login with return URL. Don't know where this screenshot came from, but if you can see, it says login with the query string return URL. That's pretty normal. I don't know what forwarders is. Oh, okay, it's orders, sorry, with the escaped sequence there. So this is saying it's going to the orders page, and that's where the return URL is. So when we go out to our authentication service and we do finally authenticate, it's going to send that query string back to the server that we're on, so we can redirect to the proper page once all the authentication is finally completed. So that's a normal thing to happen. This return URL is a common pattern that you'll find with authentication. So that's why we're failing, and that's why the JSON response is popping up the way it is. So let's see if we've got this in the network here. Let's see if we can find that exact response that's happening. Yep, there it is. So again, login, account login, return URL, and this passing that query string. So it's actually hitting this endpoint, this account login endpoint, and that endpoint doesn't have orders in it, so it's failing to serialize whatever's being returned, which is probably what's probably being returned here is actually a web page. So there's some HTML that's probably coming across the wire from this. Exactly, it's the application as a whole. Let's see if we can view source. So this is what's coming back across the wire when it hits that endpoint. So the Blazing Pizza app, when we click My Orders, it's not authenticated, and it's going to try to reach out and get orders, which it's expecting a JSON response with an order with statuses. Instead, it's getting HTML that is basically the bootstrapper for the application, and it's going to try to serialize that, and the application just kind of explodes at that point. So there's probably better ways to handle that, but this is, I don't think this is actually, I don't know if that's handled in this part of the workshop. We'll have to take a look here in a sec. Let's see. The question was, what Blazor project is this? Blazor with WebAssembly. Yeah, this is the client side workshop. So they haven't done this workshop in Razor components yet for some reason. I think there were more people that were interested in client side operation at the time they were building it, so that might be part of it. So we'll go into the next step here, but I wanted to point out what was happening with the application. Because if we look at the view, just want to make sure I got this not only correct, but the right information here. We're hitting this order details page, or sorry, the orders, my orders page. And there is this await. This is what's being called. So it's calling HTTP client get JSON async. This is the request that's getting bumped because it's not authenticated. So this request actually does complete, but it comes back with HTML, and it can't complete the process of deserializing. So it just kind of throws that error out. So we definitely need to do some fixing here. So we need to track whether the client is logged in and which user is logged in, so we can influence how the UI behaves. So this is where we begin to set up. Yeah, this is a Blazor app, not a Razor Components app. It even says here they have a ready-made component in the workshop called UserStateProvider. So let's go and find UserStateProvider and take a look at what that is. See, we've got order state. It may be in the component library. Authentication. There we go. So there's several projects. Let's close this down. In the solution, Blazing Pizza, there is client, component library, server, and shared. And in the Blazing Pizza.component library, there is an authentication folder that has this UserStateProvider component. This component is a cascading value component that just returns itself. Child content is going to end up being actually the entire application. So we can put this state provider around something in our application. And in this workshop, since I've done it before, the next step is actually going to be wrapping it around the entire app. So child component will actually become the entire application. So that makes all of the parameters available to, yeah, that would make a good shirt. Blazor is WASM. Technically it's not, but I know in the context we're talking it is. But yeah, that would be a good shirt. Let's see. So that's going to make all of these parameters available to our entire application. And this is going to have all of the things like, is the user logged in, and some functions that we're we're calling as well to check or to try sign in and stuff. So this is the guts of what we're wrapping around it. I don't believe this is explained in detail in the workshop, but for most of the intent here is that it's gonna give us kind of a provider for the entire app to see if the user's logged in or not, and give us some access to the variables and functions and things that need to happen to do authentication. So that's what we're going to add. We need to go to the app CSHTML file. So under client, we're going to go to the root app HTML, app CSHTML. So this is the root of the application. This gets stood up from here in startup.cs. So you can see startup says add component app. This is going to be that root part of our application that gets that initially gets ran by startup. So this is the rootmost element of our application, is this router. So we're going to wrap the router with this component called UserStateProvider. So UserStateProvider goes around the entire app. And there's other ways to do this as well. You could use you could use dependency injection and stuff like that. So this is just showing you yet another way to provide values across the entire application. There are other examples in here of providing global state through like dependency injection and stuff like that. And there's also Fluxer, which is a good framework for doing stuff like that. How different would this be in Razor components? Some of the authentication bits themselves would be different. I could tell you what would be the same is all of the components would be the same. So all the markup would be the same. The few things that would be different are, instead of calling HTTP client to get orders and things like that, we could actually hit directly on the database through Entity Framework. But the authentication pieces would be different because you'd be handling them all on the server. So some of the authentication would be different, but I can't think off the top of my head exactly how different it would be. Where you're storing cookies and things like that's not going to be the same. So there would be that part of it. But for the most part, 90% of the code is going to be the same component-wise. Fetching data is usually the main place where things get different. So we've made things available through the cascading component. So those values are going to get pushed down through all of the application. We only have to put that at the top level. They cascade completely down through the entire tree. The next thing we need to do is create a display for the login. So we're going to create a brand new component called UserInfo, and we're going to drop that in our shared folder. And it looks like this is going to be a very simple component. And it's going to access that state provider that we just added. So we have this user state provider. We're going to add a component now that accesses a value from it and provides a login prompt. So we'll do add new item. Make sure you choose Razor View when you do these. If you do Razor Page, it's going to try to scaffold and it adds unwanted dependencies to your project. I would expect this to change soon. In an upcoming version, I can't say when or where or how, I just don't have that knowledge. CSHTML will actually become .razor. So that will happen, and I think that problem I just talked about will not exist anymore. So UserInfo is what we're going to call this. So we're going to create this UserInfo component. Let's see. Mr. Magoo says, is it okay for me to paste the link to Michael Washington's blog? Of course. Let me double check and make sure the bot's not going to take that link and squash it first. So give me 1 sec. See if I can give you permission. I don't want to give you a ban or a timeout. Give that a try now, Mr. Magoo. See what happens. See if you can share that link. There we go. Thanks for sharing that. Appreciate it. And we have a new follower, Rob L. or Robble. Thanks for joining the show. I don't know how long you've been around, but we're talking about authentication with Blazor today. This is the client side. It's a little bit of mix, really. It's client-side Blazor application with some ASP.NET Core on the back end that's actually doing the authentication. So authentication is a server function. There are pieces of interactivity on the client, but the actual authentication piece and authorization piece happen on the server side. So we're creating this new UserInfo component, which displays... Brand new subscriber, thank you for subscribing to the show. I cannot pronounce that. I'm very sorry. Thanks for following. And yeah, Gorn, if you need to post something, I'd be happy to give you permission to do that. I know you've been helpful in the chat room here, so give me a sec. I really appreciate the new subscribe. It's very, very nice of you to subscribe to the show. I hope you follow, or I saw you followed as well, so I hope we'll see you again. I try to do this every week, so hopefully there's something we can talk about Blazor related every week. Oh, I didn't mean to time out. This UI decided to time you out, Goran. I didn't mean to do that. There we go. Let's see if that did the trick. Hopefully that didn't bump you out of chat or mute you or anything. There we go. Yeah, we've had, I've seen some things about using file inputs with Blazor, and that one happened to use SignalR, which is interesting. Let's see. So we've got our logged in user. We're going to display this user state is coming from the user state property here, and it's getting its information from this UserStateProvider instance, which comes from the cascading parameter, which is this guy that we added to the root of our application. So I'm going to save this. This basically displays if the user is logged in. So that UserStateProvider has a property called UserState, and it has a method on it called, or a value on it called isLoggedIn. So we will have that available to us. Next thing we need to do is display it. So we're going to go into, let's see, where is this piece of code? So we're going to actually, give me a second to read here. So by default, we're matching type. We'll get null if nothing is matched. So this is talking a bit about how the UserStateProvider works in general. So we're going to be we'll be using a sign in and sign out methods on the UserStateProvider. And we are only displaying logged in false, so we're going to replace the markup. So right now, let's see. So I'm kind of skipping ahead. So let's run this, and what we should do is get user logged in as false. And the next step is going to be adding some more markup here to give it a more of a user experience than just displaying a value. So we're initially just checking to make sure that the code changes that we made are working. So we'll let this spin up. Just going to reload our Blazing Pizza app. And at the top of the app, we should have on the orders page. Actually, I don't see in the instructions where we've added the user's info to the project anywhere. So that's pretty interesting. I don't remember if there was a step when I did the workshop in doing that or not, but essentially, if we added this, it would only display user logged in as false. I don't see. Yeah, we added the component, but we didn't really put it in the UI anywhere. So that step may be later in the process. What we're going to do next is we're going to update this. So we're still building out this component. They haven't told us to add it anywhere yet. So just following along with what we're told to do here. So instead of just displaying this value, we're going to put in a snippet of code here that has a button for sign in, a button for sign out, and it's going to toggle those buttons based on whether the user is logged in or not. This text with 3 dots in it, this is just saying that we want to display, we just literally want to display 3 dots if there's no user at all, if this is a null value. So that's about what that does. So if the client is waiting for the server to say whether to sign in or not, we'll get 3 dots. If it says they're signed in, it will display they're signed in. If not, it will prompt them to sign in. So now we need to go to our top bar, which is in the main layout, and add in that new component that we just created here. So if I go to main layout, we're going to leave these nav links in place, and at the very end, we're going to say UserInfo, and that can be a self-closing tag like that. So that's going to put that piece of code in our UI finally. So now it's going to show up like this on our page. So Control F5 will rerun this, and we should be able to have that sign-in box. While that's loading up, we'll take a look at the next page. So what it's doing is we're going to sign in with Twitter. This is using Twitter authentication, and this is the step-by-step process that I was kind of talking about earlier. It's going to ask the client, or the client's going to ask the server whether the user is logged in. The ASP.NET Core server. If the server is using ASP.NET Core's cookie-based authentication system to track logins, it can respond to the query with the authenticated user's name. If the client asks the server to begin the sign-in workflow, that's that return URL that we saw at the very beginning. The server uses ASP.NET Core's built-in federated auth support to show a login with Twitter dialog. So this is using a built-in, the built-in OAuth support that's in ASP.NET Core, so we don't have to write all of that ourselves. I think the build hung. So this is a regression that happened with Visual Studio 2019 Preview 2. You sometimes get these builds that hang. You can see it's just kind of chugging along down here and doing nothing. So you have to go into build, hit cancel. Once that cancel happens, we can rebuild and it should be fine. So I'm not sure what brought that back on, but this is something we've seen before in Blazor. Okay, so this looks like it's going to rebuild fine. While that's rebuilding, I want to look into this process that it's talking about. See if I can elaborate a little bit more on this built-in OAuth. Oh, that actually popped up fairly quickly. We'll let that spin up. And inside of, I think it's going to be in startup on the application. Let's see if I can find what I was assuming would be here. That built-in OAuth that it's talking about in this step 5, bullet point number 3. It says, if the client asks the server to begin a sign-in workflow, the server uses ASP.NET Core's built-in federated OAuth support. That phrase right there, built-in federated OAuth support, tells me that inside of services, we're going to add authentication. And you can see it's adding authentication using cookie authentication. And then this add Twitter. Add Twitter tells ASP.NET Core that it's going to use Twitter authentication with the options. And it looks like we've configured authentication with the consumer key and secret key inside of a configuration file. Robert the Great, thank you for subscribing to the show. I really appreciate that. If you just joined the show, we're talking about authentication with Blazor on the client side. All the authentication though happens on the server side, so it's kind of, we're talking about the handshakes that go back and forth between the two. So appreciate you subscribing to the show. Hope to see you again every week. So this add Twitter is a built-in piece of middleware. If you were here earlier, I talked about an article that I wrote about creating custom OAuth options. That whole piece dives into what happens inside of this add Twitter functionality. There's actually a lot going on inside of this. So for instance, I created a custom one that would have been add, and you can see add Twitter is in here. You can add multiple, should be up here. Authentication cookies. I'm not sure what namespace the Twitter one comes from, but you can add custom OAuth services in here, and the one I wrote would have been something like this: add Yammer, and it would have had the same kind of option scheme here. So that has a lot more handshaking that goes on underneath that you don't have to deal with directly, because we have this add Twitter service that we add. The only thing we really need to worry about is configuring it. So you would need to register API keys. So you have your consumer key, your secret that you register in the service, and it will emit the right redirects for Twitter authentication based on this middleware that we've added to the pipeline. Let's see, and it has an event on remote failure that sets up a, just closes out the window if there's some kind of failure. We'll see that handled here as well, I believe. I don't want to save anything there. I didn't really mean to make any changes. We'll go back to talking about what's happening in the app. So now you can see we have a sign in button. Let's go over to orders. This is loading ... If we sign in, we're going to get a very quick window there. Let me see if I can sign out. Let me see if I can go into settings real quick and remove the cookie. Let me pull it off the screen for a moment, just so it doesn't show anything that shouldn't be on the live stream. Let me see if I can manage cookies for this page here. And I'll try to delete my cookie so we can see the actual pop-up come up on the screen without it closing too quickly. So let's try to remove a specific cookie here. Trying to remember how exactly to do it for just this one site, not everywhere. Well, I can't remember off the top of my head how to do that. So, hey, Bruno, welcome back to the show. Glad you could join us again. Yeah, I'm failing to remember how to just remove that cookie, but you could see the page comes up. Do inspect. Thanks, Goran. And then, was it under security in here? I can't remember where this is at. Is it application? Clear storage, cookies. There we go. There we go. That's what I was looking for. So let's try this guy. Let's just clear all these cookies. Now if I come into my orders, that should do it. Sign in. Nope, that didn't do it. All right. Let's try one more time. If this doesn't work, I think you guys can get the gist. Application, ASP.NET Core cookies. I think it might be that I'm just signed into Twitter already anyway. Yeah, so yeah, I already did this, so that didn't quite do what I wanted it to do. So it will pop up anyway. We'll sign out, sign in. This would pop up with a Twitter form, and the form would have, login, username, and info. I'm already logged into Twitter is what it is. So it's immediately taking that login and saying, yes, this person's authenticated on Twitter, and then sending that information back to ASP.NET Core, and it's going to pick that data up and push that through the identity system. Same page as cookies clear store. We'll give it a try. Let's see. Let me sign out first just to make sure that doesn't have anything to do with it. I don't think it does. Clear these cookies. Clear storage. Clear site data. Give that a shot. Let's reload the page. It's basically going to have this form pop up, and no, that didn't do it either. It's just your average. Oh, actually, I know how to do this. Let's do incognito window, browse to that same endpoint. This will give me the pop-up properly. Should have done that to begin with. Sign in. So there's our sign-in page. So this is what it would expect, and then we would type in our username and password for Twitter. Notice it's been registered. There's a process that the workshop team went through to register. It makes you wonder about Chrome data. No, it's when it jumps out to api.twitter.com, OAuth, there is a token already available for that. So it's not within the context of localhost. It's within the context of Twitter itself that I'm already logged in, and it just uses that pre-existing login. So I don't have to do this every time Twitter wants me to log in. It sees that I've already logged in for a session. So they've already registered this. There's a process, a really simple one that you would go through to register your custom application through for Twitter auth, and it basically tell Twitter what endpoint you're looking for the OAuth to return to, and they give you these keys that I pointed out that were found in startup. So Twitter in turn gives you, when you register your app, they give you this authentication key, and your secret. So they can identify that the proper source is trying to authenticate. So that's where this kind of logo thing comes from. It's registered. This Blazing Pizza app is registered, and it has a set of keys assigned to it and a return URL that sends you back to the application. So I can close that one out, and I'll get out of incognito window. Just wanted to show that that pop-up comes up. So we sign in. I would type that in, and then poof, it goes away. And now it knows my username. So it gives me, let's go to UserInfo. The username is coming from this user state object here. So user state, current user, display name, all comes from that UserStateProvider. So the Twitter service sends back that information to the application, and it's populated inside of this component here. So this user state is where that's coming from. You can actually see where it's getting this from. So if we go to the user endpoint, that's where it's getting that data from. So let's take a look at the next piece. So we looked at this where it says we have the ASP.NET Core built-in OAuth support for Twitter. You could easily reconfigure this with Google or Facebook, and even use ASP.NET Core's built-in identity system, which is a standalone user database. This is the part I was talking about at the top of the show. If you weren't here, I wanted to really clear this up. I get this question a lot, and people ask, can I use authentication with Blazor? What they really are asking is, can I use ASP.NET Core's built-in identity system with a standalone database with Blazor? So the answer is yes, but you don't get the helpers out of the box like you do with ASP.NET Core MVC right now. So you have to generate all of these views, including this user secrets or user state provider and all that stuff that's done in the workshop for you. You would have to roll your own or copy this one out and customize it to use the identity framework for Microsoft. So yes, it's compatible. It's just not easy. One of the steps that's taken out of this when you use the Twitter authentication is this standalone user database part. When you assume the role of authentication, you also have to stand up a database, and there's scripts to help you generate the database, so it's not that big a deal, but you're still responsible for setting up the database and any customization you want to do to that. And then there's custom identity objects that go along with the database. So you have to wire those things together manually right now. After the user logs in, Twitter or another authentication provider, the server sets an authentication cookie that subsequent queries with will return the authenticated username. We saw that. That's why I was trying to log in, or I used an incognito tab to log in. The client displays whatever username the server returns. So again, this is all happening server side, and it's being sent. The information is being sent down to the client. So all the authentication is server side. Subsequent HTTP requests to all endpoints will include the cookies, so the server will be able to authorize the request. Again, that is all happening through that attribute that we added. If I go into my orders controller, that's what this is doing here. So that's going to look for that cookie, and if it is authorized, then it will complete the request. If the client wants to log out, they can call the endpoint and clear the authentication cookie. We actually did that a few times. You'll notice that the UserInfo sign-out button is wired up to the UserStateProvider sign-in method. If you check the source code there, you'll find that it makes a call from JavaScript interop. displaying user, sign in, return URL, current URL. Let's talk about that for just a sec. So we're talking about this UserStateProvider, and it's saying that it's using a JavaScript interop to call out to that authentication service. Let's see where, yeah, auth pop-up. So this is that pop-up that shows the one I had to go in incognito to get to. What it does is window.open, and it's going out to this sign-in URL, and it sets the return URL. And when we saw this fail earlier, that's part of that login process. So once, this is how it knows what page to go back to once we've actually logged in successfully. So it's going to return us to the page that we were trying to access and initially failed at. And then when it's finished, it calls a sign-in state changed. So it's actually calling back into C# code and invoking a method within the UserStateProvider. So from JavaScript, once we complete that action, let's see, where is it in here? I'm not sure where exactly that function. Oh, there it is. On sign in state change. So JavaScript actually calls back when it's done and passes in the user state from that response. And that's how that gets completed. So we were able to sign in. There's some caveats, I guess, that people can run into. In order for authentication to work, you have to be on a secured connection, so it has to be HTTPS. So if you're running on your local machine and it's HTTP, which this is by default. So if I was on, let's see if this works. This is the unsecured port, which isn't running. Saying connection confused. If that port was running, it wouldn't allow authentication. We don't have that issue, but it's telling you how to resolve it if you bump into that. So if you're seeing that this completely is failing every time, you may want to check and make sure you have HTTPS enabled. So this is persisted by a cookie, so we can actually close the application, come back. We're still going to have our orders displayed. It's just letting us know that. So now, if you're now logged in, you're able to place orders and see a status. But if you log out and try to make an order, bad things will happen. It's going to reject your post. So if we sign out and go home and try to make another order, so if I say order, it doesn't do anything. So there's something failing in here, and it's letting us know that that's an expected behavior. So again, it's trying to serialize something. It's making an async request. Oh shoot, I just closed my notes. It's making a request, and it's getting back an HTML response when it's expecting JSON. So it just throws a ton of errors. So it's going to reject the post because we're not logged in, causing a client-side exception. That's what I was just saying about it's getting HTML and trying to parse it as JSON. It's just going to throw up. The user won't know why. So we need to make a prompt to tell the user to log in as part of placing an order. So that's going to be the next thing we need to do. In the index component, use the cascading parameter to receive the user status by adding the following block. We're going to use that same thing that's wrapping. So we have that wrapper in place already. If we go into our main layout, actually if we go into, our app, this UserStateProvider, we're going to call on that again. So on our index page, it is telling us to add a reference to that user state provider. So I'm going to add this cascading parameter, user state provider, and it's going to grab that instance. Kind of similar to dependency injection. It's just going out and looking through the hierarchy of the application instead and finding this user state provider there. So now our index page is aware of the login, and I accidentally clicked Visual Studio 2017. That should really help the performance of this machine right now. Let's see, I think I have not only done that, but I've hung a build again. Let's cancel the build, close Visual Studio 2017. These are things we don't need. And go back to our documentation. So we're going to do place order so that if the user isn't signed in, they'll be sent through the sign-in workflow. So under place order, we want to check and see if the user is signed in first. So our index page has a function called place order. And right now, if we're not logged in, so the user state provider has its own routing. It's actually it's actually sitting at the root of the application level. So it doesn't have a route. It's not a page. So if we look at user state provider, it doesn't have a route at all, because if it did, it would be up here and it would be page and some route name. So it literally has no routing. What it does is it wraps the entire application. If we look at app CSHTML, every component that gets loaded into the app gets loaded into this router. This is the root component of the application. So inside of this router component, the index HTML or index CSHTML gets loaded when we call the root of our application. So when we hit the absolute root of the app, inside of the app CSHTML router, the page gets loaded. So therefore, if this is on the outside of the user state provider, then it has every page that's loaded within the router has access to the values within it. So that's what we set up when we called, or when we added this parameter, is we're telling it to look for a cascading parameter in the application hierarchy and resolve the user state provider and call it user state. It's a great question though. Glad I could help with that. So now that we have access to that again, we're going to wrap this piece of code, because right now, if the user is not logged in, it calls post JSON async, and when it hits this orders API, it goes off to the API, or it doesn't get to the API because it gets redirected before it can complete. Actually, it hits the endpoint. Sorry, it hits orders. It will hit orders, and then it will hit, let's see, place order. Which one is it calling again? Index. It's calling, the task is place orders, but it's calling orders. So it's doing a post JSON async. So it's looking for a post action. So we need to find post. So it's going to call this. When it tries to call this action, it can't properly call it because it's going to get bounced to the authentication page. So it's going to be asked to sign in, which is a 200 response that gives back HTML, not JSON. So it will never be able to do this async post. Any data it gets back is going to be HTML, which is essentially the login page. It's going to fail. So we need to wrap this up so that does not happen. So we're going to await we're going to say if await user state, try sign in async. And that's going to do a proper redirect first before we hit an endpoint and try to serialize something that isn't serializable. So this, that kind of explains what I said. Now when you're signed out, you try to place an order, it will ask you to sign in. So let's give that a shot. We may not see the prompt because it's going to do that thing again where I'm already signed in to Twitter, so it's going to be very quick if it does prompt us, but it will definitely fix that error. Once that happens, we'll try this next step out, make sure this build doesn't hang. Looks like it's doing okay. The next thing we'll do is handle the sign out of users on my orders. So if you're signed out and you're visiting my orders, we want it to gracefully reject that. Instead of causing a client-side action exception, we can display a UI that reminds people they need to log in when they're viewing my orders. So now we can create an order and hit order, and instead of blowing up, notice it pops up the login box, already logged in, so it's just going to pass through. And now we get this page. If I sign out, this is where we see there's actually going to be an error under the covers here. That actually didn't show an error. Let's try again. So accessing the order page while I'm logged out. There's the errors. So now that everything else is working, when I'm on the orders page and I just haven't signed in yet, it's still giving me this error because it's trying to go out again to a login page versus an endpoint. So we need to clear that up. I'm going to misclick again in Open Visual Studio. I need to move this guy out of the way. I just keep bumping into it. So we're going to fix that problem next. So any page that requires authentication, and any page that has an HTTP request that requires authentication, we need to kind of wrap those things in this workflow so we don't accidentally hit those endpoints. We need to gracefully provide prompts for the user and stuff like that. So on the orders page, one way would be to use the cascading parameter and query the list if they're logged in. We have the same logic in order details component. So we're going to share code across all the pages that require authentication. So let's see, we're creating kind of a global experience for the app now that kind of takes care of all of these things. And it's going to end up being this sign in button. After that, we'll handle the sign out with order details, and we'll redirect to a page. So we want to gracefully sign people out if they're signed in and they hit a page that requires authentication. And then finally, the last step is filtering out the user's orders. And that's the piece of commented code that is in, let's see, that's the wrong Visual Studio again. In the orders controller, the last step will be on all of the get orders. We're going to go ahead and comment out this where statement. And what this is going to do is actually give us the orders that only belong to that one user. Currently, it's just grabbing every order that's in the database. So we can actually go ahead and on-comment those. They're literally in every one of these actions. So we want to make sure it's on post. And on the gets, we only want to commit orders for the person that's logged in and get the orders that belong to that person. I hope I didn't break anything by jumping ahead there. That's going to be the last step anyhow. So we're just making this an experience that works everywhere in the app. We're going to do that through a new component called force sign-in layout. So we're changing from implementing this functionality on every component to just creating a layout that handles all of this for us. So we're going to have force sign-in layout. That's going to be in our shared folder. So I'm going to add a new item. And they're essentially in the workshop just trying to show you how to use layouts instead of repeating logic across multiple pages. All right, so we'll copy this out and I'll explain what this does. So every page is going to have this need to check. Let's see. There's actually, this is a namespace change. I don't know if this is layout component now. They changed the namespace between Blazor 7 and 8 for layout components. Let's see, inherits component, components library. Nope. I'm trying to remember what this is going to be called now. Let's see if I have another layout. Force sign-in the main layout. Layout component base. This is a name change, namespace change. So in the documentation for the workshop, again, I'm using a branch that is newer than, so here, I'll write it here. This is Blazor 070 namespace. This is Blazor 08 namespace. This is a breaking change that is not in the documentation yet because they just haven't updated it yet. So we'll remove that. Layout component base is the new layout base library. So we're going to inherit that. We're going to use the main layout that's already there. We're just going to piggyback on main layout. And every page is now going to have access to this user state through the cascading parameter that is using this layout. So we're going to either have this loading text, or if the user is logged in, we'll go ahead and display the body of the page. If the page is not loading and they are not logged in, it's going to display, hey, you're signed out. To continue, please sign in, and then prompt them with the sign in button. So this is going to affect every page that uses it. So this is just an easier way to implement this rather than go into each page individually and make sure that they're logged in. So the next thing we need to do is go into my orders. In my orders, we are currently just using the default, which is main layout. What we need to do is instead layout, let's see, I don't remember if you have to use an equal sign here. Nope, just use this force layout. So it's going to say the layout is going to be this layout component instead of on index and on order details and each individual page, implementing the same logic, the same if statement over and over again. So now the users will see the message, you're signed out, and then we have the sign in button appear there. You can click either of the two sign in buttons, this one or that one, to sign in. If you browse directly to an order while signed in or while signed out, or click sign out, then you'll get this kind of like error message, a graceful error message. So it says you can fix this by, because the server is rejecting the query for the details while signed out, You can fix this by changing order details to use the new force sign-in layout page. So we'll just go back to the page where we've already implemented that functionality directly. So order details. So we can just up here add layout, force sign-in layout here, and that'll fix any kind of graceful error messages with a sign-in button instead. So that should actually complete the entire workshop, or to this point. So we'll rerun this and we'll see what we've done. And I'll review for a second. If you guys have any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer the best I can. Hopefully this showed how to hang builds. It's hanging again, I can tell. That bar just immediately got stuck. Cancel. Wait for that to on hang, rerun. Either I'm being impatient or it hung again. No, it's still running, it looks like. Okay. So the article that I posted very early on from Simple Talk that I wrote goes way more into detail than what's needed for this. So it will walk you through creating custom OAuth providers in .NET. But if you do give that a read, it will give you more insight into what happens behind the scenes with all these handshakes that go on. So if you want to get like some deeper knowledge of all this stuff, you can check that out. I'll post that in the show notes. I'll try to pop it here in the chat room again at the end as well. But now we've completed this whole experience where you can see it signing me in when I place an order. It's now showing just my orders. And if I sign out, I get a nice error message, a friendly sign-in message instead of some random error. I can click sign in. It'll pop that prompt again. And that completes the entire experience for me. So I don't run into these weird scenarios where it's throwing error messages. So it shows you how to use a layout component, how to implement security across Blazor with ASP.NET Core as your server. Again, everything security related is done on the server side. If you look in Startup CS and in Orders Controller, that's where everything's really actually handled. The only thing that Blazor is doing is passing the values that come back from the authentication service to the application to be displayed in the UI. So the key places to look are in ASP.NET Core in your services. This is where you add your authentication support for your app on the server side. Once you have that, you add your authorization attributes to the proper places where you need authorization to happen. And then you need to have an experience on the client side that sends you off to the proper authentication places when you are not authorized. So you don't end up hitting these endpoints unauthorized and causing errors. So that's about the gist of how all of that works in a nutshell. The workshop, again, it's available. Now I'm going to click Visual Studio Code by accident. The workshop is available. It is slightly out of date. I'm sure they'll be updating this soon or pulling in this pull request that I mentioned. The documentation is pretty solid still. There's a couple little gotchas in there with the new version of Blazor. I don't think it's anything that's going to hang people up too much, though. So I still highly recommend checking out the workshop, and it'll catch up very quickly, I'm sure. So I'll post all of these links in the show notes so everybody has access to it. But hopefully that clears up some of the confusion around, can you authenticate an app with Blazor? I think the answer is yes, you can. Obviously, we just did it using Twitter Auth. What people don't have is, and I'll show you what I think people are wanting when they ask me this question. And I'm going to close this solution out. I think what people are confused within their terminology when they ask this question is they ask, can you do authentication in Blazor? And they are wanting to know if I can do this. Create a new project. Create a new ASP.NET Core application. I'm going to go ahead and create that. This is going to spin up the new app dialog. I'm going to choose, I'm not going to choose any ASP.NET, Blazor or Razor components, because the identity functionality is not built in yet. What folks are asking for is, I'm going to do an MVC app, and what they really want to know is if this piece works. And I can see where the confusion comes from, because it says authentication, no authentication, hit change. And inside here, what folks really want is this individual user accounts or identity. And you create a new identity database when you do this. That is not part of the file new project experience yet. Even when using Razor components, that dialog is not there. It also doesn't have these other authentication bits inside of the dialogues either. So that I think is what people are looking for, not so much, yeah, you can roll your own authentication using these 9 steps found in the workshop. They want to be able to come into Razor components, unless this is, oh, well, maybe this will prove me, oh, no, okay, see, the dialogues are disabled. Maybe they're heading in that direction, because I don't recall this showing up before. But currently, no authentication is what happens. There's no way to click these radio buttons. So you can authenticate, you just don't have it out of the box. So that's the answer I want to give when people ask that. So authentication can be done. It just needs to be rolled on your own. Can you create a web application with authentication and copy the generated code into Razor components? That is a good question. So no, you can get some things possibly done. You could probably generate the backend, and you could use it as like a reference project, but you're not going to be able to copy the views directly, at least not at this point. There might be something in the future where you could move Razor components backwards into web MVC application or Razor Pages application. But if we do this and we say use individual user accounts, hit OK, create. Let's go ahead and create this guy. You're going to get a bunch of views, but the view code is different from Razor components. So the back end may actually work. The front end would not. The controllers, I have to check another dialog and see if there's another way to go about this. So you're going to get an area called identity, and your view is under here. It's actually all abstracted away. So this actually makes it a little more difficult. So this is going to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole, but I want to answer your question correctly. So Shotcare asked, if you create a web application with authentication, can you paste the generated code into Razor components? The answer is a very long no, and there's very many reasons why. For one, all of the view code is actually abstracted away. The view code is actually found in NuGet under ASP.NET Core, Microsoft ASP.NET Core .identity.ui. So all the views are actually under this NuGet package. So how do you get those views out? They actually belong in this area under identity. So how do you get those? If I right click and I say add new scaffolded item, there's actually an override mechanism in here, and you can see identity is in here. If I click add, it's going to give me a page with lots of checkboxes. These are all of the pages that are part of the identity framework. This is why people don't want to have to roll this on their own, is because there are literally this many views involved with all of the processes that go along with authentication. These are all inside of a Razor library right now. So if I click override all files, I don't know if, yeah, there's the DB context I'm going to use. I don't have a user class. I'm going to hit add. Let's see what this gives us. So this is actually going to spin up a version of all of those Razor pages or MVC views with the interactive bits, the UI bits for authentication. This may take a few moments. It's really going to take a few moments because it's a lot of pages that it is it's building via templates. So how this works is there are views inside of a Razor components library in that Microsoft.NET identity.ui library. When I place a page under areas identity pages with the same page name that is in that Razor components library, or Razor UI library, it will override that functionality. So the scaffolder is generating every view that will override that entire Razor UI library. Once it generates all of that code, it is incompatible with Razor components. So there's where your long no comes in. All of that will be incompatible with Razor components. So if we look under account now, we've got all of these views, and then we've got all these views for managing account details. Because remember, we're not using Twitter or something external. We're using our own service, and people might want to change their details, their username, their password, things like that. So all these views then need to happen. So if I open up, say, personal data, this view is responsible for displaying, what is this thing called again? What's that law that was passed that lets you remove all of your data? Thank you, European Union. What is this thing called? There's an acronym for it, but it allows you to control where your data is stored. Change password, for example, lets you change your password. Like, these are all things you would have to recreate in Razor components yourself. You can't copy this code directly over. You could copy it and you'd have to modify various parts of it. You could use it as a template maybe to start from, but it's not going to be a one-to-one thing that you can do. And then on the server side of things, and that's a lot of pages to recreate, by the way. I mean, look at all that work that needs to be done. But once you do it, yeah, GDPR, thank you. That's what I was looking for. GDPR added another half dozen pages in here. So there's that as well. So once you decide you're going to use identity, then you are responsible for the GDPR stuff too. Let's see what else comes along for the ride here. don't see the controller actions for all of these either. There's a controller action for all those views. Identity pages, accounts. Nav pages. I'm not seeing the controllers. I don't recall where those get generated. I'm trying to remember. There may be another route to this as well. Let's see. What if we do Web API? Let's see. I just want an API, Web API application. They move the cheese quite a bit in here. ASP.NET Core, is Web API under Web Application? I can't remember. Razor class library. Yeah, API. Does this one have... Yeah, this would probably be a better starting point, is to use the API template and then use individual user account. It looks like the only option they have is to connect to a store in the cloud. I'm not sure why that is. So maybe that's not a good starting point, unless you want to handle that database in the cloud, which is also fine. So you would handle the user store inside of Azure. I don't know why there's no option to use a local store, but you could use the Azure part of this. Use the individual user accounts. Hit OK. It'll scaffold out the API controllers for you. It'll use Azure on the back end for the database, and you could then add Razor components to that project. Might be an option. But currently there's no easy path, I think, is the answer most people are looking for. There's nothing out of the box. You're going to end up rolling your own something somewhere. So excellent question, Shotcare. Let's see, we got just a couple more minutes. If anybody has anything else they want to review or ask, I'd be more than happy to talk about it. Otherwise, I will put show notes together, and I promise I'll get them out this time. I'll backdate last week's as well and post those too. So hopefully this gave some insight into the current state of identity and the possibility of authentication in Blazor. It is a thing. Requires a little bit more work than maybe MVC does currently, but it is a possibility. It's something that you can enable, especially with third-party tooling like Twitter, Facebook, Google, and I would imagine Microsoft Auth is all in there. So that's about the state of things. Oh, Janescu's having pizza while I'm teaching how to make a pizza app. Good stuff. And good luck with the QSharp or Quasar project there. Let me know how that turns out, and we'll talk about it on the show sometime if it's a success. Other than that, thanks for joining the show. Thanks for the new subscribers and followers. Appreciate you guys keeping the show going. Well, I don't know what we'll cover next week, but enjoy your weekends. Goran, you enjoy your weekend too. And I'll tweet when... Shotcare, can you do this in VB? No, not that I'm aware of. There is VB in ASP.NET Core now, but there is, or sorry, in .NET Core. I don't know if it's in ASP.NET Core. I don't think there's any templates for VB on the website of things yet. That's something that you want to voice an issue on the ASP.NET Core repo for, or upvote. I'm sure it's already there. It's just getting some popularity behind that vote is what you need to do. But there's currently nothing out of the box that I know of. Not for ASP.NET side of things, not for the web. So sorry about that. So you guys have a good weekend. Thanks for joining me on the show. It was fun as usual, and we'll try to find something cool to talk about next week. I've seen a lot of good projects out there from folks. Mr. Magoo, if you're still there, is doing some crazy stuff with pixels lately and blowing up Azure accounts left and right. And there's a lot of fun demos being built, and we'll try to feature some of those on the show as soon as the bits are available and don't kill Azure accounts at the click of a button. If you're on Twitter and you're following some of these guys, then you probably know what I'm laughing about. But if not, we'll have to feature those things soon. So thanks a lot, and take care, everybody. We'll see you next week.